Okay, so, okay, actually, I want to go back to one other thing, and I'm not going to skip back because it's too many slides, but one other point that is not always obvious. If we go back to that metal detector idea, right? So these neurons respond to rapid changes in context, right? So if you think of how metal detectors work, right? If they only you can only notice the difference in the beeping if they change a lot fairly quickly, right? If the beeping, say, were to increase by 10% over the next 15 minutes, you probably wouldn't notice that the beeping rate changed. And so one thing that people think about, like, oh, heroin's really addictive, but codeine's not so much, right? Well, pharmacologically, they both turn into morphine and work on the exact same receptors. But the thing that's different between them is heroin people tend to take in ways that make it hit the brain fast, right? So if you shoot up IV heroin, that morphine hits you like that, your little metal detector neurons, right, your VTA neurons are going to fire really, really fast because it was a big change quickly. If you take you take codeine, right, you got to wait, it's got to be metabolized, it comes on slow, people usually can't process it that fast. Your opiate levels are going to drift up really slow. It's kind of like, just increasing the beeping rate really, really slow. Your reward system doesn't notice that much. So when we talk about opiates, people, there's a whole variety of I could go through the pharmacology, but it really doesn't matter that much. They all do the same things. For the most part, they work on the same receptors. There's not functionally a lot of difference in terms of what they do. The main thing that matters is how fast they come on, right? So fentanyl in a transdermal patch, not that addictive. That same fentanyl taken out and IV injected, really, really addictive, right? Because one hits the brain fast, the other very, very slow. So when you're thinking about shaping behavior or how much behavior is going to get shaped, it matters a lot how quickly the opiates come on. Okay, so let's think about things. So one of the ways that pain can get worse, and that there's at least a population impact on chronic pain, is if you add rewards for experiencing pain or acting disabled in any sort of way, you're going to encourage persistence of that pain. One thing we've found, if you talked at least to patients, at least 80% of them will tell you that their doctor told them to take their meds as needed, right? And what most of those patients, you talk to them, interpret that as is, I need to take these when I need them, right? Which a lot of them take as a challenge, right? Like, I'm not going to take this until I need it, right? They use it, they wind up taking that as, my doctor wants me to use this to cope. When I can't cope, try to do whatever else I can, and when I can't cope, go ahead and take this med. Well, it just turns out, like in addiction, when you study addiction, the big predictor of developing substance use problems when you use addictive substances is using to cope. If you use when you feel bad or when you're stressed out to get yourself to sleep, to deal with all sorts of bad things, your likelihood of developing an addiction is much, much higher, because that reinforces that state in which you need relief. And one of the nasty things about drug use is it activates stress circuits as well. The more you use them over time, the more you wind up developing more negative affect. It activates circuits that reduce your ability to cope with stress, right? And so you're going to feel worse over time, and then you're going to have situations where you can't cope and where you feel lousy, and that are perfect for using that drug again over time. So the more you give people learn to use to cope, the more at risk they are of developing problems. And does this really matter on a population basis? Well, we did interviews with, I think, about 200 patients who are taking opiates and just asked them, how do you take your pain meds, right? And we found there were sort of three main categories of the way people took them. The vast majority of people used it symptomatically. They took opiates when they had pain, and only when they had pain. There was another fairly large subset of people who took them on a schedule. So they just said, I take them when I'm told to take them every 6 hours, I take them every 6 hours. And then there were very few people, probably about 10% of people, who used them proactively to promote function. So they said, I know I really love to garden, but I know when I garden too much, my back really hurts or my knees really hurt. And so they take the opiates before they go garden so that they can keep gardening, or they know they're going to physical therapy, it's going to hurt really bad, so they take it before they go to physical therapy. And what we found was that people who said that they took it in response to pain had much, much worse mental and social and pain functioning related outcomes than people who took it on a schedule and people who used it for function. So the way they used these seemed to have a lot to do with whether or not they had a good outcome or a bad outcome, kind of as you would predict based on reward learning. There's also been a whole variety of studies looking at workers' compensation claims, and one of the things they find is that patients that have opiates prescribed right after injury have much greater risk of persistent disability after you can control for injury severity. So it has less to do with how injured you are and more to do with whether you got prescribed analgesics after. And there's actually been studies that have shown that with non-narcotic analgesics as well. So things that also do a good job at reducing pain quickly seem to have the same effect. So it does seem to in fact matter in terms of whether your pain becomes chronic, how this learning occurs. Likewise, disability payments has one of the most common, the strongest predictors of poor outcomes. So people who get paid essentially to be dysfunctional are much less likely to get better. They have worse pain symptomatology, worse function than people who don't. And that's been shown in a whole variety of patient populations and samples. So not saying, obviously, disabilities in workers' compensation, really important to help people get back on their feet when they're done, but you got to be careful how you do it or you can wind up getting them stuck in a bad place. Not on purpose, but again, these circuits don't learn, or learn problematically. Other place what this is commonly shown, and it's again one of the main predictors of lack of improvement, is what psychologists like to call solicitous spouses. And the idea here is there's a subset of loved ones whose main response to pain is to help, right? So if they see someone in pain, the thing they need to do right then and there is make them feel better immediately, right? So they wind up hugely reinforcing people's hurt or distress. They only help, they only pay attention, they do everything nice to you when you are upset, right? And what does that do? That trains you to be miserable and grumpy and upset all the time, which probably doesn't make you the funnest spouse to be with anymore, but it also leads you to a high risk of chronicity and pain. And there's been studies that showed if you have a solicitous spouse, it's a substantial risk factor for pain persistence, for winding up on higher opiate doses, and for not getting better. What am I suggesting? So I'm going to get back to that. Don't worry, I'm not saying spouses are bad. So this, I think, I found this on the internet on the, quote, Board of Wisdom, which I think summarizes the commonsensical but not right way to think about helping people, right? So it said, when a person causes you pain, they don't care about you. When a person stops your pain, they care about you. When a person will do anything to make you feel no pain, they love you, right? Which sounds good, it sounds great, right? But if you understand how reward circuits work, right, stopping somebody's pain may just be encouraging them to feel more pain, and that's not really a nice thing to do, right? Sounds nice, but not so great, right? So what actually helps is helping people do the things that actually make them better, helping them towards behaviors that will improve their quality of life, that get them stronger, that help them recover from injury, so on and so forth. That probably more times than not involves pushing people to do things that make them uncomfortable, unhappy. They're probably going to make their pain worse before it makes them better. But the loving thing to do, if from a long-term perspective, is to make it as easy as possible for that person to go through all the hard work they're going to have to do to get better after they're hurt. And so what's been found is if you have loved ones that support you in self-management. So when you can't cope, they sit there and they go, okay, I'm going to do some deep breathing with you. Let's think about something better. Like, let's remember that vacation we took in Hawaii. Let's talk about that, right? That helps them reframe, right? Like, no, I'm pretty sure you're not dying here. You're gonna be all right. You know, the pain's gonna go away. And here, let's go do something to distract you. That adjust tasks, right? So maybe you don't make them take out the garbage, but that doesn't mean they get to sit and lay on the TV, lay on the couch and watch TV either. Maybe they do something else that doesn't hurt so much. So you adjust tasks, just make it possible for them to do things without it being so problematic. And then reinforce them every time they do something good, right? Like cook them a nice dinner when they go to physical therapy so they have something nice to come home to when they're feeling kind of cranky. Get them... call up their best friend and get their best friend to take them for a walk, right? Because they weren't going to bother do it themselves. Like, there's all sorts of things, wonderful supportive things that you can do to help people through pain that aren't taking away their pain right then and there. And there's been lots of studies, patients who have loved ones that do that, that encourage their well behaviors rather than try to save them from pain, have less pain behavior, and they have much better functioning, where the opposite's true of the rescuing patients. And so, okay, it's theoretically time for a break. Would you guys like a break now, or would you like to finish up this concept and then go and then break? I have like 10 more minutes. Finish? Okay, so ID here, there's been all sorts of studies that show now, or a few studies anyway, that show that take people and put them and have them and image them while they are in the presence of somebody else in pain. And one of the things you can show fairly easily is that when you are with somebody in pain, it activates your pain circuits. It really activates your pain circuits. Not your sensory ones, obviously nothing's happening to your sensory circuits, but you experience pain in your cognitive and emotional circuits. And they've shown as well that if you, if you take a partner and you, as fMRI researchers are really fun. So this one, they took somebody, hooked them up to an electrical shock generator, and then stuck their partner in the fMRI machine while the person was being shocked. And they either let them hold the person who was getting shocked's hand or not. And then what they found was allowing people to hold their partner's arm when their partner was experiencing shocks activated their reward circuits, right? So the viewer of the pain is reinforced for doing things, for providing support when someone they love is hurting. And what that means really is that chronic pain doesn't just shape the behavior of the patient, of the person with the injury, it shapes the behavior of everyone around them as well. And so you've got to be careful, all these sort of pitfalls that can wind up making pain more chronic. They're going to be the patient's going to be intertwined in a context, in a group of people that care about them desperately. And if you don't get them all on the same page in terms of how we're going to get this person better, you're going to have trouble making headway, essentially. Okay, I'm going to come back to that after the break. But thing I point out here too, clinicians are just as impacted by this as patients and by loved ones, right? So exposure to patients in pain is going to trigger pain in clinicians too. That's going to reshape how they behave, right? And just as proof, they've done cool studies now, proof that this is actually activating the same dang pain circuits in clinicians, you can, not only does it look like it's the same circuits, but if you provide the physician with relief, they show less empathic behaviors to the patient, towards the patient, right? So giving like acetaminophen to somebody viewing someone else's pain will reduce their empathy for the pain. If they can't feel pain themselves, then they won't feel anyone else's pain either, right? Weird thing, I'm not suggesting clinicians run out and start taking prophylactic acetaminophen before they deal with their pain patients, but interesting concept, so just in case anyone doesn't believe this is real. So they've done some studies now showing that whether or not the clinician expects a patient to experience relief, patterns their behaviors, activates their reward circuits very, very strongly. And this was another clever fMRI experiment where they took physicians, well-trained physicians, and they told them they had a brand new analgesic device that they were testing. Wasn't really an analgesic device, but what they did, because these people were interested in placebo, but what they did was they had a little machine and they heated up clinicians' arms so that they would feel pain, and then they let them press the button to turn on the machine, and then they turned the temperature down on the thing, so it seemed like the machine worked to convince them that it was good, and they showed that the clinicians believed them, that this was a fancy new analgesic device. And then they took a patient there and gave the patient the same painful stimulus while they were imaging the clinician. And first, this shows, okay, when the patient wasn't getting pain and wasn't getting any help from the analgesic device. So when the patient was just sitting there was very little activation in ventral striatum, which is another name for the nucleus accumbens, essentially. When they gave the clinician, they told the clinician, okay, now we're gonna cause this patient pain, but the analgesic device, it doesn't work right now. You have the button, but the machine's not on. So when the patient experienced pain and the clinician could press the button that he didn't think was doing anything, you got some activation in the ventral striatum, right? Because presumably most clinicians have learned that when patients are in pain, they can do something, right? They're fairly empowered people. When they did the same thing, when they were told the machine was on and that they could help reduce the patient's pain, they had huge activation of their ventral striatum. Their reward learning circuits are getting turned on hugely. And the way I think about this is like, opiates are the perfect self-advertising medication, right? They make everybody happy. They reinforce the patient. They're going to come back and do it again. The provider provides them. They're going to want to do it again, right? Your brain, everyone's brain's set up to want to give these things out as much as possible. And that's what's happened. So as regulations and as people weren't discouraged to do this or weren't scared to do it, the prescribing just went through the roof. Because that's what we'd expect to happen, because we all have brains, right? Okay, and one other sort of nasty part of this is if you think about this, how this works, the more empathic you are, because feeling other people's pain requires your empathy abilities. People who are more empathic feel other people's pain more, and that's been shown in a whole variety of studies. And empathy is generally one of the best things for clinical effectiveness. The more a patient feels that they're allied with their provider, that their provider understands them, that they feel what they're feeling, the better they do functionally, outcome-wise. It's something that we generally really encourage in clinician-provider interactions. But in this, and interesting, the study that I showed you with the activation was focused on whether the ability of MDs to induce a placebo response in their patients. And the providers that had more activation of those reward circuits were the providers that were really good at making their patients feel better with nothing, right? Which is exactly what you want your providers to do, right? But the problem is the providers that are best at doing what we commonly want them to do clinically are the most at risk of developing analgesic prescribing habits, right, in this whole thing. So we've got to find ways of not shutting down the empathy, right? Like, they don't go take pain meds so you don't feel your patient's pain, but how can we keep the empathy and reduce the risk of developing habitual prescribing patterns?